afternoon to, or good morning to all of you out there. So, hopefully you can see my screen, and there we go. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to talk a little bit about building a future-proof workflow. And you know, when people think about workflows and business today, they're usually very focused on today, and also have a very interesting view in reverse. They look behind, but this is really about, as things are changing, and they are constantly changing, it's really more important for you to take a look at things from a future view. So first of all, let's get some context. So where are we? You know, if I take a look at the current state that we're in, kind of pre-pandemic, if you will, pre-COVID-19, we did some studies, and if we look at those studies, we can see that a lot of the printers, a lot of the print service providers felt that 2020 was going to be a great year. That, you know, if you compare it to what they expected in 2019, you can see they expected that their business would increase more than 10%, and actually the vast majority of them, over 60% of them, said probably close to 60% would be increased. Of course, just when you think things are looking good, some things happen. And of course, we had this pandemic, and unfortunately, we are now going through some synchronized slowdown. Now, this is the growth projection actually for pre-pandemic. But if we look at the growth projection for post-pandemic, it's looking pretty scary. But it's not something that we really need to, I mean, yes, we have to think about it. Yes, we have to concern ourselves, but more importantly, we have to use this as an opportune time to rethink how we are going to work throughout the future, and work within the future, and work within the new constraints. And if you look at the world output in this case, in 2020, yeah, there's no doubt about it, advanced economies are projected, according to the International Monetary Fund, and we seem to be tracking that way now. Advanced economies are looking at about a 6% decline this year in output. Next year, they're looking at actually about a 4%, for advanced economies anyway, a 4% increase in output. So, you know, through 2021, while we won't necessarily get whole, if you will, for what we lost in 2020, we'll be on our way to get back. So what do we do in the meantime? Because things are going to continue to move. We still have to be able to go and run a business, etc. So where are businesses going? You know, we can say, we can follow the sheep, if you will, and continue to look at what other people are doing, or we can begin to think about how can we use our strengths and our awareness and tools to help us move and be prepared for the future. Well, first of all, one of the first things we need to look at and we need to see is that while companies are growing, and we're talking about growth, we're talking about percentages in these cases, they don't all grow at the same rate, at the same growth rate. As a matter of fact, it's interesting, and these are primarily North American figures, but if you look at the Drupa figures, they're basically the same, and the Drupa figures are basically a global look at it. And what we've seen is that the smaller institutions are the ones that are actually going to see the most growth, where the bigger ones are going to they'll see some growth, but it's going to be a little bit harder for them for a lot of reasons. First of all, they're growing from a higher position to begin with, and smaller companies obviously are there's more room to grow, if you will. But I think that one of the big issues, and this really has nothing to do with the pandemic, because this was happening before we had this pandemic, and it's one of the things that people have to kind of remember or get their head around before they think that all the problems we're having are going to be based on the fact that there is this pandemic. So we have to look at the historic market segments. For years, for decades, these were the kinds of segments, market segments, that print service providers were looking at and were dealing with on a regular basis. But what's been happening, and a lot of this has to do with market shifts, consumer behavior, technology advancements, etc. The effect of the internet and online publishing and shopping and business, for that matter. If we look at the new segments, okay, and this is really, if you look at this, the printers and the print service providers were actually doing well now. They kind of have broken themselves into these primary categories, and there's a really a good reason for that. Each of these categories actually has, they have some subsets, they have some different types of products within them, etc. But each of them has a lot in common. So in a commercial print environment, if I go to commercial printers, they do direct mail, they do brochures, forms, sign and display, etc. But there's a lot of similarity. If I would compare that to what I'm doing as a publishing printer, the requirements for that, it's going to be a little bit different. A packaging printer, the requirements are going to be very different. And even if I look at within a packaging printer, if I look at labels, cartons, corrugated, flexible, the kind of the four main pillars of packaging at today, if I look at those, yes, there are some distinct differences between them, but interestingly enough, they're a lot more similar to each other and within each other. And that's very important, because it's very important as you begin to look at how you build and look at futures and future workflows, how you approach them. Now, as we start to consolidate into those new market segments and that we looked at, there's still going to be these two prime differentiators, okay? Because print is actually custom manufacturing. So the question then becomes, well, okay, so how custom is it? If we looked at printed products, and I break it out this way just because for me it's easier to identify. But if I look at printed products, I think about predefined kinds of products, business cards, envelopes, books, things like that, constrained design applications, etc. Even things like wallpaper or sign and display. Those are somewhat printed products. If I think about printing services, well, now we're starting to get into these kind of ad hoc, very custom kinds of designs that require different types of variable production techniques. And that's really where the big differentiation is. And when you're looking at workflows, you really need to look at them as almost two separate areas. That doesn't mean that you can't automate them or you can't develop systems and effective processes for each of them, but you shouldn't let one of them. So, for example, you shouldn't say, well, if I get a few of these jobs in and they're ad hoc designs, so I guess I can't automate or think about building future workflows that will allow me to optimize production. And you can't do that. You absolutely have to use the 80-20 rule, if you will, that we often talk about, where 80% of your revenue comes from 20% of your work, which may be the printed products. Ultimately, as we go forward and as we're moving forward, process integration and automation is really what's driving the new economy, and not just for print service providers. This is really in all manufacturing and actually even in other types of services, business services. It's really process integration and automation. We talk about things like Industry 4.0. What is that? That's process integration. That's really what it is. And why do we do that? Why does it make sense to do that? Well, it makes sense to do that because ultimately, when you get efficient, when you're able to deal with automation and streamlining production, you wind up being able to do more with less. Yes, does that mean it affects the existing personnel? Absolutely. But they also need to move with this and deal with these kinds of changes. Otherwise, they're going to be left behind. So, if we look at the increase in automation over the years, and this one goes from 1992 to 2015. What you can see is that the amount of people it took to get something done dramatically was reduced over time. So today it's, we're at least a few $100s, or if not more, per employee in terms of manufacturing. And we're back, when this graph started, as low as under 150 or about $150. So there's a big difference. So how do you look at a workflow? How do you look at building something that's going to allow you to do business, manufacturing, work with other kinds of customers going forward? And this was I was involved in putting together a study a number of years ago, and this was actually, it goes back far enough. It was based on something that we did in looking at futures and future workflows back in the 90s when I was doing some studies for Siebold. But basically what this is it says, look, you need to look at business processes, manufacturing, how we're just interacting with our internal and external members, if you will, of our ecosystem. How are we doing this? And this is a diagram that actually puts it into some perspective. As you can see, we often looked at if we start at the bottom, we often look at this bottom rung in a manufacturing environment, especially in a print production environment. This is where really the main focus of most printers and most print service providers. They think about the content, the data, the input, processing, and output and delivery. No problem. That's a very limited view. And until you start to add these other layers, whether it's process management or business and information management, and more importantly, the external connectors, because ultimately, while business, process, and production, process management, production, actually are your internal, or as a print service provider's internal focus. That's where they tend to look at their view. The reality is they don't live in a vacuum. They actually deal with external people, whether it's partners or for outsourcing or for buying other goods and services and materials, or it's their customers themselves. And each of these, whether it's a customer or a partner, has the same types of layers within their environment as well. So if you think about it, what's happening is we're kind of all working and playing with the same kinds of rules and the same kinds of needs, but we have to do it together. We can't do it alone. So we have to be able to integrate. And what are we integrating? Ultimately, we're integrating data. So it's all about collaboration. It's collaboration internally and externally. So let's first start to look at internal collaboration. First of all, as I said, there's kind of this increasing demand for process connectivity, right? There's new ways and new demands for standard ways of connecting pieces of your internal operation together, whether it's the way your Webtoprint system sends information, takes the onboarding of jobs and sends information into your MIS system or down into your production system, or back up and again out to your Webtoprint system or your web shop. Those are the kinds of things that it's not even an option. It's something you have to do, because if you're not doing that, you'll never be able to survive. You're already putting too much labor into things. The cost of just manually intervening in all these things is higher in many cases than it is for the production of the actual product itself. And if we look at the information sharing, it does a lot of things. First of all, it allows us to streamline. It eliminates islands of information and islands of production. We'll look at some of those in a second. And what are the tools that are allowing us to do that? And again, it's really all about data. And it's it's XML, it's JDF, it's XJDF, JMF, all these wonderful acronyms, which are really the blood, if you will, that flows through these systems and that connects these systems. So the integration of these are critical. If we look at what a service provider's shop or plant will look like today, it looks very different than it used to look. There are many disparate offerings and technologies. It used to be all that they had to look at and think about was, well, we had this offset press, and then we had CTP, so we had to have so we had some digital information, but all it did was really allow us to make plates for the offset press. And then they got digital machinery in, whether it's cut sheet digital machinery or roll fed or whatever, roll to roll. And finishing. And each one of these digital pieces of equipment that we brought into the shop had its own digital front end, which actually manipulated or allowed you to control the machine, but also manage the manipulated data. So now what happens as a result of this, or what has happened in many cases, as a matter of fact, even in most cases that I've been seeing, is that we wind up with these islands of automation. We wind up with these silos ultimately, because each one of these has its own front end, and people view them as separate units. So this CTP device and this is one workflow. This cut sheet printer and this device and this DFE is one workflow. This large format output device, one workflow. Again, CTP, one workflow. The reality is, though, you don't have one workflow. You've got, in that case, you've got lots of workflows, and you wind up with production silos. And these production silos are very inefficient, and they cost a lot of money, and they cost a lot of time, and they introduce lots and lots of mistakes because they are separate and distinct. And the more you add to something, unless you can begin to integrate and normalize a lot of these things, the more cost and the more intervention that's required. So, if you have a manufacturing facility, it's a print manufacturing, some kind of a service provider, and I don't care whether this is for packaging or this is for any one of those things that we laid out before. It could be functional printing, it could be published printing, etc. You really start by looking at it in high-level processes. People have a tendency to jump right into the weeds and start looking at, oh, well, let me see if I move this here and I connect these two pieces together, that'll solve all my problems. And in some cases, it may solve a problem, may create 3 other problems. But really, the most important and the most functional way to do this, the most advanced way to do this, is to start by dividing into high-level processes. And they're fairly straightforward. So you have customer input, right? And each one of these inputs that are coming from the customer, this only shows 3, and in many cases there's dozens of them, of different types of input, but so each one of these may have its own characteristics. So immediately you need to normalize them. You need to normalize that input so that once that input is normalized, it comes out of here, you now can begin to streamline and optimize the rest of the processes, because now you can check and prepare the files in a much more streamlined and automated fashion and standardized fashion. Keyword there being standardized. I know there's going to be a lot more talk about that during the course of this webinar, not just mine, but more importantly, David's following me. And then output. And it's interesting because when you look at those, whether it's a cut sheet device or it's an offset digital device, it's an offset press, or it's a roll-to-roll device, again, people have a tendency to think of them as, oh, well, this has to go on that machine. Well, the reality is that, if you're very efficient at what you do and you've gotten to the point where you've normalized your input, you've checked and prepared, you can then have the flexibility, provided you have production management and business management kind of communicating with these systems, to make a change and say, originally this was going to go on an offset press, but now it's going to go on a digital press. And I don't really need to worry about that because everything is already normalized to allow it to do either of those or any of those. And the same thing then happens with finishing, because depending on what output device you're using, it may change the way it needs to be finished. Maybe the finishing device itself may be different. It may be an inline device. It may be an offline device. Those are the kinds of things that can happen when you start to look at your processes as in a high level and understand the benefits of having them connected like this. So what kinds of tools are there that allow us to do automation? Because that's really what we're talking about. And ultimately, it's really about pipeline automation, right? And pipeline automation, people think about that and they think about, well, what does that mean? Well, that means that one machine can talk to another machine and we send it some information, JDF information, whatever. Well, that's kind of like pipeline automation. But the problem is that there's different types of pipeline automation. There's kind of predefined pipeline automation, which basically says, yes, if I give you this, I'm expecting that, right? Or linear automation where I've got, which is also very similar, it's kind of an offshoot to that. I've got a hot folder, I'm going to drop something in there, and it's going to just find its way to the other side. It's going to go in here, it'll process, and it'll go out the other side. But if you start to think about the disparate nature of the equipment we have and of the requirements coming in from customers, because those are they're changing big time now. Then you start to look at the advances and the need for a rules-based type of automation. And there's different kinds of rules-based automation systems out there. And rules-based automation systems allow you basically to say, okay, I want to, go from here to there, but based on what the characteristics of that input is, I will make a decision, or the rule-based system will make a decision as to what needs to be done. So you don't have to worry about it. It'll make the decision based on the actual device itself, the actual file, the actual data itself. It's interesting when I look at the different types of systems that are out there now and the automation systems that exist out there. Many hardware manufacturers who supply DFEs, and they call that their workflow. And they do. When you buy, it's not just the DFE. It's not just something that actually controls the machine. They believe that it controls your workflow, and they do it for a number of reasons. First of all, because it's fairly limited in terms of what it can do, and they don't want to overpromise. But also because in many cases, if you're buying a hardware system with a hardware DFE, if you want to get this level of, or these kinds of levels of automation that we talk about, you're almost forced to buy another one from the same vendor because they work very well together, but it's not practical, not in the long run, because it's not like the old days where I was a Heidelberg shop and everything I owned had to do with Heidelberg. So everything worked together. Or I was a Xerox shop and everything I bought was from Xerox. And all those DFEs and their workflows work together. Those are what I would consider to be engine forward kinds of workflows. Not really the most practical way to look at things. Then there's application forward. Okay, so those application forward types of workflows, well, they're specific workflows designed around maybe commercial print or a packaging or large format output. But again, if I'm on that printer where I showed the diagram before, where I've got large format output, I've got roll to roll, I've got cut sheet, I've got all of these different kinds of things, all of a sudden I'm very limited by just a very specific application forward type of workflow. The solution forward is it's much broader. Okay, that's really where a solution forward basically says, you know what, it's a broader focus. I can probably manipulate it and manage it in many different types of ways to be able to customize it to my specific needs. Ultimately, you need all of this. It's not either and or both. You really need a combination of all of them, and they need to work together. Because that's how all of those disparate pieces then become one holistic type of workflow. This is just an example of one. This is in focus. This is a workflow I had developed from one of my clients, and it basically looks much more complex than it is, although there's a fair amount of complexity. But what it does is it ties together a lot of disparate, kinds of information. So in this case, it ties together an MIS system, a CTP device, some creative software, some imposition software, the customer itself, and communicating with the customer, where we're actually bringing in work from an FTP site or manually submitting jobs. All of these things are actually tied together. And this is how you have to think about it and how to look at it. And we talked about before about the kind of the blood that flows between all of these things to help bring life to them all. And in this case, for the most part, is XML. I mean, there's other formats, but in this case, XML is really what's carrying a lot of those instructions. So this is the way you need to begin. And when you begin to build something like this, all of a sudden, all of those disparate things start to tie together, and you find yourself having to manage exceptions rather than the rules. Remember, we talked before, I said the 80-20 rule, 20% of the work, you get 80% of the profit, but 80% of the work has still got to be done. As you start to pull this together, you can start chipping away at that other 80%, and it brings that number down. And look, if you can automate 40% of the production that comes into your plant as opposed to 20%, well, all of all those extra costs go right to the bottom line. You're bringing home more money. You've got more money there, and as you increase that, more and more goes to the bottom line. When you think about building these systems, you really need to think about system modularity. And in today's environment, because first of all, things have to be open. Do they have to be cloud-based? There's an advantage to it being cloud-based. Sometimes there's a disadvantage, but the modularity of the system, being able to connect, whether it's a cloud-based or an on-premises type of system, on all of these highly functional components, because they're constantly changing. They all have to be built and looked at as a modular solution, not as yes, ultimately it's a total solution, but it's built on all of these different modules, and they're disparate modules. Again, it's not all coming from one manufacturer. It's coming from a whole assortment of manufacturers and a whole assortment of developers that are allowing you to put it together. Because if nothing else, even though in an internal, remember we're talking about our internal collaboration, right? Even in an internal system where you can control things like that, once you get to your customer or to your vendor partner, well, now you don't control it anymore. They've got whatever they've got. So what about external collaboration? The processes and roles are definitely changing. In the past, pre-press was split between the designer and the printer. Automation actually supplanting a lot of those responsibilities. Some of the pre-press companies now have added design services, and this is stuff that you've seen. This is basically the history, and it just keeps going on and will continue to go on and on. As a matter of fact, the only thing that's changing now is that as a result of the pandemic, the rate of change is actually increasing. More people are looking for automated solutions and remote solutions and cloud-based solutions than they did before, because they're understanding how important these things become. And whether it's the next pandemic or it's the next change of consumer behavior, it's going to continue to change. And again, as I said earlier, it's about data. It's about capturing, segregating, and managing data. And if you think about the data types that you're looking at, it's really four. I break it out into these four categories, right? Just because it's easier for me. And obviously there are subsets to it, but you've got kind of your production data. Those are those PDF files, right? Then you've got your production data instructions. Okay, so I have this PDF file. What am I supposed to do with it? Then you got the business data. Okay, who's it for and how much are they giving me and when do they want it? And then in many cases, you've got variable data because it's a variable data job. it's direct mail, it's a transactional document. It's so I've got a data stream there too. And each of these data streams play a role or could play a role. Matter of fact, all of them should, except maybe variable data, in almost every job that goes through a production plant. One of the more important roles today is how do we bridge the customer and the production facility? And it's interesting, people talk about web to print. And I hate that term, and I hate it because what does that even mean? I've actually done many studies on this, and I've asked many people, oh, web to print. And he's, oh yeah, we have a web to print solution. Yeah, we've got this FTP spot, and people drop files in there, or others have a smart FTP spot where people can drop files, or they go to it's a web upload screen where they upload a file. Well, is that web to print? What about if I have a constrained design? It's a or a catalog print solution where I'm building business cards, and you log on and you fill in your information and you get out business cards. Or I'm in cases now, I'm doing the same thing for packaging or boxes or box manufacturing. All of these things are increasingly becoming more complex, but this interface between the customer and the print service provider is crucial. Ultimately, the file that gets produced is usually going to be a PDF. It's either going to be a PDF coming in, or it's going to be normalized down to a PDF, because all of the front end equipment that exists today for manufacturing, for the most part, is going to be PDF. Yeah, there's some other, if you're doing transactional documents, you may be getting other types of feeds, but this is really the bulk of what's coming through now. And why PDF? Why is it even important? And David, I know we'll get into it a lot more later, but why is it so important? It's important because it's a standard exchange format. Basically, it's a container for content. PDF is really about objects. It's this content container with a bunch of objects in there. It's widely supported. It's easy to transfer and work with. It's reliable, especially if you're working with a PDFX or a PDFX Plus. And it helps maintain divisions of responsibility. So PDF is working very well with commercial print, and it actually can work now with digital and is working very well now with digital packaging production as well. This is a quick overview of the PDFX lineup and kind of the history of PDFX, if you will. And this is, again, a precursor to some of David's discussion later. And for the most part, unfortunately, some are still using this, which presents more problems than it's worth, which is why they have these little traffic stoplights here. Basically, if it's red, it says you really shouldn't be using this at all. If it's green or yellow, it's like, okay, you got to use this. That's fine. Yellow's okay. But it presents other types of issues or introduces other types of potential problems, which David will talk more about as well later. The PDFX 6, which is it's not released yet, but it's based on the latest version of PDF, which is PDF 2.0, should be coming to a theater soon near you. And we're looking forward to that. It'll take a while for all the applications to be able to support it and the DFEs to support it, but it will happen, and it will make life a lot easier. And just a brief introduction to the GWG, because I know that I was introduced as an analyst and a consultant, and I am, but I also happen to be the chairman of the Ghent Work Group, and have been working with the Ghent Work Group for almost 20 years now. It's an amazing organization. And our original claim to fame was that we said, you know what, PDFX is great, but because there's a reliability factor to it, but unfortunately, the reliability is good, but the requirements are not necessarily the same if I'm going to packaging or if I'm going to a newspaper, or if I'm going to build a commercial print job or a large format output job. So we created this PDFX Plus concept, which David will talk to. But the other thing that the Ghent Work Group does, and I think that this is important and it's very much worth mentioning, is we have other things that we have. And if you've never been to the Ghent Work Group site, and it's gwg.org, it's real easy. We have a lot of information there. We've got white papers and we have file settings that you can actually import into applications to help set up files or to give to designers to set up files. We have test suites that allow you to test workflows, job tickets based on different types of market applications. We have them for packaging, and we have them for advertising, for publications, and you know, a lot of white papers in education. So there's a lot up there, and you could basically, it's like going down the rabbit hole when you get up in there. But I can tell you that once you start working your way through it, it's all very good information. And you know, in our case, when we look at things like job tickets, I mentioned job tickets, we look at it in a number of ways. The first job ticket we put together was for communicating ads to publishers. And we spent up, because that was one of the early focuses of the Ghent Work Group. And then as we started to kind of get that down and standardized, we said, okay, where else do we believe we're going to need to do this and communicate information beyond, in a standardized way, beyond just a PDFX with, you know, this is the color space, these are the objects inside, and you know, just print them that way. And communicating information like structural information, bleeds, creasing, cutting, all of these processing information that goes beyond content. That to us is like a job ticket as well. And we actually created this too. Ultimately, we threw it over the wall to the ISO, which we do with a lot of the work we do. It became a standard, and it's ISO 19593-1. And you'll have to remember that because you'll be tested on it later. Ultimately, what do you need to know? And kind of in summarizing a lot of what we talked about today, look, it's ultimately about bridging these processes, right? It's an increasing need to join businesses, creative people, customers, because we're all working together. We don't really work in silos. We don't work in silos within our own plant. We don't work within silos within our entire value chain. Customers are not just customers. They're partners. They're part of your process. And ultimately, all this multi-level data and communication is critical. E-business, you know, it's that facilitates. This is just the next level of it, right? This is how do we communicate the information between business partners? I go to a lot of customers now, and while some of them, whether these are customers, consumer product companies or manufacturers or print service providers, whether they're communicating through a web services portal or a web shop of some type, or they're actually using some kind of EDI where they're actually passing between their systems, between these disparate systems, they're passing in information connected through, it's XML information, it's JSON, whatever. They're passing this information to be able to coordinate these processes. This is the future. This is actually, it's not just the future, it's today. But it is for sure the future. So where do we stand as an industry in terms of making all of this happen? Well, so this was again, this is a little depressing. This was actually last year though, pre-pandemic. We asked 285 commercial printers, primarily in North America, although some in Europe. You know, where are you going to spend your money next year? What are you going to what did you budget for? And 32%, we have no planned investments. Well, that's just wrong, because that means you're not even thinking about it. Unless you're so far ahead of everybody, you don't have to worry about it. Bindery equipment, very important. This is always good. New space, new location, great. Workflow automation. These are the kinds of things that people need to be looking at. You need to get individual pieces of equipment, whether it's another press or another digital press, an offset press, but being able to connect all those things together, that falls all in this area here. This is the reality. This was done. This is a study that came out just last year. My friends over at InfoTrends put this study together. Keypoint Intelligence, they call themselves now too. And they asked printers, so how much automation is in your plant? How much of this stuff is automated? Well, 25% said, 25% said, yeah, most of it's manual in more than one department, but not all of it. 43%, well, there's some automation, but manual processes in many departments. 18% all manual processes. So this is sad, because basically what this says is that over 70% of the processes are either manual, partially manual, i.e. they're siloed, like we talked about before, and that means they can't begin to take advantage of all the efficiencies that are there and that will allow them to grow in the future. Some things are easier to automate than others. Commercial printing, because of the disparate nature, are not as easy. Obviously, things like transactional are very easy. You can get to almost to a lights out type of thing. All of these things, but all of them are automatable. I actually looked for that word in spell check once. I don't think it exists, but to me, it's automatable. They can be automated. So what are the important concepts? Manufacturing mentality, process automation, collaboration. Those are the three. This is the obstacle. Adoption is a function of adaptation. People, I go into a plant, the first thing I tell people is, because they're excited, usually they call me in, that means they want to do something. And I said, well, we really want to do this. And I said, look, first thing you got to know and understand is technology is easy. People are hard. It's real easy to buy and build and put in technology, really hard to get people to adapt to it. But they ultimately do. And so how do you even begin to start? Well, first thing you do is you start with the low-hanging fruit. As I said before, you look at you start and build that first diagram I showed you, which is the high-level diagram. And you don't have to do it all at once. I mean, the diagram you should do all at once, but how you begin to do the implementation around that diagram. And just think about it as a roadmap. Basically, where do you want to go? And the other thing I ask my customers when I go in, so what do you want to be when you grow up? Where do you want to go? What's your ultimate goal? Once you understand what your ultimate goal is, you understand where you are today, you can build that roadmap to let you take it there. Sometimes the biggest problem is you don't have the internal skills. And if you don't have the internal skills, that's not a reason not to do it. There are plenty of people out there that can help you and can help you make that happen. So with that, Ivana, I'm ready for questions.